Thank you for inviting me this morning. I also was very taken with the title Co-Creating the Digital World, because hopefully my presentation will outline how important co-creation is going to be to Ireland as we move through the digital decade. So when I started, my title was Government in the Digital World Beyond 2027, but actually it would probably be Ireland in the Digital World Beyond 2027 is a better title, because hopefully what I hope to bring out this morning is the importance of government in driving the digital economy in Ireland, and the importance actually of academia and so on in helping contribute to that journey. So I want to start with a quote from the Taoiseach when he was Taoiseach at the end of last year. And when he launched the white paper on enterprise, he talked about the growing use of technology and that would just continue to accelerate. And he said at the end, there will be a huge expansion of the tech sector in the medium term, and we need to make sure that Ireland is at the forefront of that. And I always like to use football analogies, you know, because I'm a great fan of football. Unfortunately, a fan of Tottenham Hotspur for many years. But, you know, it's a bit like when a club goes up into the Premier League and the chairman says, you know, we want to be in the Champions League in 3 years. You have to prepare for that. You have to focus resources at that. You have to start to get everything right, from the academy that creates the talent in the club to the right manager, to the right philosophy and all of those sorts of things. And actually, this is no different. If Ireland is really serious about being amongst the best in Europe, everything has to be coordinated together. And hopefully I'll illustrate that over the next 20 minutes. So what I want to talk about is the digital decade itself and what Europe think and believe the digital decade needs to be about. And then a little bit about where we are in Ireland, and then some of the challenges ahead. So the digital decade itself, just as we look to be coming out of COVID, when President von der Leyen did her State of the Union speech in September 2021, she basically said the future is about digital and green. That's what's going to drive the European economy, European GDP up to 2030. And she wasn't wrong. I think she very much picked up that the world had changed in COVID, and we all used examples of digital COVID certificate and Zoom and all of those sorts of things. But I was at the presidency meeting in Sweden last week, and as you do, withdrew some Swedish krona currency in the airport to pay the taxi. And the taxi didn't take cash anymore. It was completely contactless. In fact, it was a nightmare to try and get rid of 1,000 krona in 4 days, because nowhere took cash. Shops, everything, restaurants, everything was contactless. And so this world in Sweden has moved to a digital world far more rapidly than we would ever have anticipated, but we're not going to be far behind that. And so the Commission in their 2030 strategy set out this concept called the Digital Compass, which had associated targets and were aligned to the Recovery and Resilience Plan. So every member state, like Ireland, who drew money down from the Recovery and Resilience Plan, basically signed a contract to say that we would deliver in these 4 critical areas of the European Digital Compass. And if you look at them, you know, Marcus was saying at the start, we're only a breath away from 2028. You know, people are starting to look at those and say, are we actually going to be able to deliver these, even though it's 2023? And if I just give you one example, if you look at skills and you see they want 20 million people working in the digital sector. Now, not people like me and John Barron, who happen to be techies working for government, people who actually work for the Microsofts and so on of this world. That's 10% of the working population. Ireland is ahead in Europe, and we're about 6 to 7%. But a lot of that is actually made up of Europeans and others who have come to Ireland to work in the tech sector. We're not growing our own Indigenous talent fast enough. And if we continue at the pace we're doing, we're not going to meet our 10% target, let alone exceed it, which is what we need to do if we're going to be at the forefront of Europe. So we need to rethink many things, many priorities. And just to give you an example, one of the countries talking at the presidency meeting last week basically looked at this and said, how are we going to get more females, more young girls into cybersecurity? And they've basically introduced grants for girls who will go to university and train to be cybersecurity experts. If we tried to do that in Ireland today, you would hear, but what about teachers and doctors and nurses and so on? It's difficult. But if we're serious, we've got to make choices, and we've got to make hard choices, and we've got to stand over those. Because what other countries in Europe are saying is, okay, so we'll pay X thousand to encourage these people to become cybersecurity experts and other experts. We'll increase that fourfold, fivefold, sixfold in GDP by what they'll give back to the country once they've graduated. So it's thinking differently about how you plan and how you strategize for this. With the digital decade now, we're in the process of creating our national development plan, which is how we intend to meet the targets. Now, luckily, as I'll show, Ireland was ahead of the game in this, and Ireland's one of the forefronts in Europe in terms of the strategizing and planning, but we've actually got to deliver as well. And with the Compass targets came this whole raft of legislation. And I know from the panel speakers and emails we've been exchanging, there's various views on the value of all of this legislation. Certainly in Europe last week, it was very clear there was various views on the value of the legislation as well. Some countries believe it is absolutely essential to put Europe in the position where we can achieve the targets we have. Some countries believe it's a distraction from actually getting the work done. And I'm sure you'll form your own views of that, but I'll give you maybe two opinions or alternative views on the value of this legislation. The first one actually comes from Eric Schmidt, who is the former CEO of Google. And of course, if you follow European politics, you'll know that the American tech companies are not as welcome across all of Europe as they would be in Ireland, is probably the best way of putting it. And Schmidt, of course, he was interviewed for the Tallinn Digital Summit. It's well worth looking up in Google, actually. It's a great interview. And he was talking about AI, but he said, you know, the problem with you guys in Europe is you start off by trying to do regulation for something. He said in America, we start off by trying to work out how we can use disruptive technology to grow our economy. Then we look at the risks, and then we look at how we regulate the risks. And he said, maybe you should think more like us, and you might actually achieve your ambitions. So that was one view on the AI legislation. But if you look at another piece of legislation, it's this idea of the Interoperability Act. In other words, this idea that we will create all these mandatory standards and have this way that we'll all end up using the same software in Europe. Now, anybody that's as old as me and been working in tech as long as I have will remember that when we started off, you would have been thrashed with a stick if you tried to solutionize through technology without actually understanding the process and the outcomes you were trying to achieve. So to start to create laws around technology without understanding how we deliver on the outcomes that we're trying to achieve is madness. And just to give you an example of that, Europe would say that the single digital gateway will allow someone in France to buy a property in Ireland so as they can come and live and work in Ireland, and they'll have that property all organized before they come here to get their new job. In Ireland, you've got to get a PPSN before you can buy a property, or John Barron up there will have a word with you, you know. But every single one of the 27 member states has exactly the same legislation. So the single digital gateway can't work on its own. It has to be part of a complete rethink about the movement of people and what that means and how we permit it and how we deal with bad actors in that space and all of those things. So it's a challenge, and trying to take bits of it and say, we'll do this differently, just simply doesn't work. So where are we now with moving towards that? Well, we spent the first 5 years from 2016, when the strategy was produced, really talking about the building blocks for the digital decade. And at that time, in 2016, Europe was still talking about e-government, which is something very different from digital government, as we'll show. But we came up with all these principles around the customer experience, how they could access government services, about the reuse of data, which became the once only principle, and the core underpinnings of that, which were sharing infrastructure, sharing key products like gov.ie as it became, and so on, about developing our talent and about putting the right governance in place. And thankfully, actually, that worked very, very well. You know, one of the big things in Europe is this idea of using a state EID. In 2016, MyGovID had less than 10,000 verified users. At the end of 5 years, we had 1.8 million verified accounts. We didn't have an access portal for citizens in 2016. Gov.ie has now got more hits than RTE, and did have during the pandemic. We didn't have legislation that enabled us to share data, but we now have the Data Sharing and Governance Act. So we've really pushed on and really tried to build up from the bottom and create this momentum in which we could succeed in delivering our digital targets. And just to go back to MyGovID, because it's quite phenomenal, in June, we broke through 2 million verified accounts. That means that 51% of the working population now uses this government EID regularly, not just has one, but uses it. And if you look at that graph on the right, now that's actually from a couple of years ago, but if you look at where 51% would put us, you can see actually Ireland is accelerating faster than any other country in the world, and we're moving rapidly towards the world leaders, which is great, but we need to build on that. In the DESI Index for Public Services, which is the big way in which Europe manages public services or assesses where we all are, Ireland's sitting in 6th place, which is quite good. But when you dig below that, you can see that there's certain things that we really do need to attend to if we're going to keep the momentum up. So this is how we focused on governing towards the EU Digital Decade. And at the time, Ireland was about to produce a national digital strategy anyway. So we basically took it and reformed it and very much aligned it to the key compass points of the digital decade and put in an extra section on regulation, because actually the country of origin principle is critical to Ireland and Ireland's place at the center between Europe and North America. And Ireland being able to keep the country of origin principle means we're responsible for the regulation of the Googles, the LinkedIns, and so on, which is as important to them as it is to us. And so if you Google and download the Harnessing Digital National Digital Strategy, you'll see how we set out Ireland's targets against the EU targets. There's one notable exception in healthcare, where at that stage, we weren't able to make commitments to the EU targets. We're now moving into a position where we have a clear plan to give the public access to some of their health data by 2030. But this is from the Berlin Declaration, and this is a different way of assessing the country's digital health. And you can see that there's areas where Ireland do extremely well. You would expect fundamental rights and democratic values that Ireland would score well. We're actually maximum, we're 100%. Ireland apparently is the second best country in the world in terms of freedom of press and democracy and all of those things. But there's areas where we're planning, so social participation and inclusion. We've issued or will issue a digital inclusion roadmap later this month. But then there's areas where we're not doing just so well. Digital empowerment, digital literacy, that means the entire population and so on. We could do better. And actually, if you dig into that, you can see the areas where Ireland scores less well than the EU average. And I'll not go through them individually, but if you look at 4.1, promote the rollout and use of a notified EID in the public and private sectors. In Ireland, our legislation forbids the use of MyGov ID by anywhere other than public service. And so this is where the government is going to have a think about, do we extend the use of this? Do we create something else? But if you look at what the EU vision is, for example, for a digital wallet, this idea that I could go to France and hire a car and open up my phone, and just like we do with our boarding cards nowadays, there's my driving license on it. But it's no good to me if I don't have my insurance certificate on as well. So we've got to enable that, to enable our people to have the same rights and so on as other European people. So there'll be challenges for us going on forward. I'll leave the slides, it's worth looking at. But there's areas where we know we can achieve the targets. And obviously 7.4 there, exchange of crisis management data. We're in a different position to other parts of Europe, but we need to work out how do we at least manage that? What do we need to do in order to make that happen? And actually, you know, if you look at something like our dependency in power, there's ways in which you can run that narrative and make it work in Ireland. So I'll just finish with some things to be positive about. And I think that there's lots to be positive about. And in our Connecting Government strategy, when the ministers launched it, they talked about the talent that's available in Ireland. They talked about the political will to succeed. And they talked about Ireland moving into that DESI top 3 from 6th place into the top 3. So the ambition's there, but as I said at the start, the ambition has to be followed by actions. And we've very much aligned the strategy to this concept of digital government. In fact, as I'll highlight, digital government plus, because it's further than that. But the idea of digital government is that if e-government was computerizing how you always did things, digital government is starting with the customer experience and rethinking how you provide the service in the first place. And if you think of the digital COVID certificate, for example, that Eva referred to earlier on, that was classic digital government, because we started with a problem that we had this pandemic, then things were getting better and people wanted to travel. So how do we enable that to happen? And so the digital enabled a solution that wouldn't otherwise have been possible, or certainly not practical in the same way as we were able to achieve it. And so, you know, back to the co-creation idea, right at the core of the strategy is this interdependency. If government is going to drive the economy, then we're going to have to work with our own business to do that. And we're going to have to focus on our indigenous business as well. It's great to have the biggest companies in the world all based in Ireland, but they might not stay forever. We need to have a plan B, and our plan B, your plan B is always creating indigenous talent, helping that indigenous talent to create IPR, using that IPR to sell into Europe, create more jobs and so on. So that dependency of government and industry is critical. But of course, that has to be fueled by talent, and talent comes from places like this and academia and research and so on. And so engaging with society and getting society to understand what government is doing is absolutely critical to moving forward. So these are our priority projects. I just want to whiz through a couple. Life events is what's considered to be the elite of digital government. It's now some of the most forefront nations in the world are moving into this area. And the thinking behind life events is government actually knows when people need services. You know, I was talking to Joan before the start on bereavement, you know, and bereavement's very difficult. But actually, what makes it more difficult is trying to work out who are all the people I need to tell, what are all the things I need to do. Government knows that. So government can do a lot of this for you. And that's what the idea behind a life event is. And there's some early examples. Finland, New Zealand, Singapore are leading the world in this. Ireland wants to join them and being in the early top 4 or 5. And we've actually asked the public, what their preferences are for life events, and they've told us they're very interested in us working in this area. And so one of the outcomes of that is to take gov.ie and make it more like the EU single digital gateway and reposition it very much about the customer experience, as you can see on the right-hand side where that goes. The other area is complying with the IDAS regulation, and I talked about digital wallets. So these are from the prototype of Ireland's digital wallet. And you can see we're going to have to fine-tune branding and so on, but we've actually demonstrated now that we can take a credential and take it from government data and put it on your phone, that you can use it, and you can use it independently and without government knowing how you're using it, which is clearly what the people want. Very much aligned with this idea of an anchor ID and very much aligned with MyGov ID. And so there's just some examples of what that looks like and what the credentials look like. So thank you very much. I see I'm about to be thrown off.
Thank you very much, Barry. That was so interesting. I really appreciated your perspective, and I found your talk very positive and very reassuring in the way that Ireland is situated currently, but also in its ambitions as we go forward. Thank you very much indeed. I'm sorry for rushing you towards the end.